So, welcome to part two of the progressive movement, where we left off there. And we talked about how the progressive movement was a group of people or organizations who wanted change, progress, reform through governmental action, not just the work of one or two individuals. It begins in the cities with settlement workers and reformers. And the reformers are speaking about the need for laws regulating tenement housing, child labor, things like that, and better working conditions, especially for women.
In the late 1800s, the United States experienced rapid industrial growth. Many people left rural areas or their homes in Europe to find work in the new factories in America's cities. Large corporations spread across the country. New schools and universities were established to educate the growing workforce. As people became more educated, the newspaper and publishing industries boomed. But this period of growth also included corruption and inequality. Big businesses often use their growing profits and power to destroy competitors and form monopolies in the railroad, steel, coal, and oil industries. Working conditions in mines and factories were harsh and dangerous. And as people flooded into the cities in search of work, the problems of crowded housing and poor sanitation increased. Corrupt city leaders called bosses often accepted bribes and gave contracts and jobs to their political allies. The reform movement of progressivism arose to combat the greed, corruption, and other problems that industrialization had created. Progressives, most of whom came from the middle class, wanted to improve the lives of the poor living in America's growing slums. They also condemned the abuses of corporate power and the corruption in city governments. Progressive writers wrote fictional stories and poetry that revealed the hardships faced by many people living in America's cities. Progressive journalists used biting articles and cartoons in newspapers and magazines to expose the corruption of city bosses and business leaders. These writers were called muckrakers because they dug into the dirty deeds of those they wished to expose. Progressives succeeded in creating a public outcry against government corruption. Teddy Roosevelt was America's first progressive president. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt used his position to break up many trusts. These were huge combinations of companies that used their economic power to take advantage of their competitors and workers. Roosevelt's Square Deal was designed to give all Americans, from farmers to businessmen, an equal chance to succeed. Roosevelt created the Pure Food and Drug Act to protect consumers, and he established the National Park System to conserve the environment. Progressives also hoped to win the right for women to vote. Suffragettes, or female activists, had been fighting for the vote since the 1840s. By the early 1900s, support for women's suffrage had grown as more women took jobs and became better educated. Finally, under President Woodrow Wilson, reformers convinced Congress to pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. When enough states ratified it, the amendment passed. Now women were guaranteed the right to vote. Despite these improvements, many people felt left behind. America's minority populations and new immigrants continued to face deep prejudices, segregation, and violence. While progressive activists succeeded in reducing corruption, improved worker and food safety, and increased the rights of women, widespread racial injustice and anti-immigrant sentiment remained part of American society.
So you can see the progressive movement through Teddy Roosevelt. You need to know from 1901 to 1909, he was a progressive president. He improved worker safety, reduced work hours, new restrictions on child labor. So, improved safety conditions resulted in laws passed by states that made employers liable, means responsible, for the safety of their employees. So, if you're bringing people into your factory, that factory needs to be safe, so that things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory won't happen again. They reduced the work hours. States began to reduce the amount of hours that workers could work. This is where you start getting into, the 8-hour workday and that sort of thing, because we find that it's not just the reduction in work hours, it increases safety because workers are not exhausted. Their productivity goes up actually with fewer hours worked. So it works out well, not just for the worker, but usually for the employer also. Especially women and children were taken into account in these laws. All right. And so states started to ban child labor. So, like we said earlier, not everyone was in favor of this because it cut down on the family's income in the short term, but in the long term, it allowed children to go to school and thus elevate themselves to what jobs they could get later on and do better for themselves and their families. Women's suffrage. Suffrage is just a fancy word for the right to vote. Okay, suffrage and suffering are very, very different things. Women's suffrage was the fight to get women the right to vote. And we know women from all across the country and from all walks of life joined the battle. They marched in parades, they picketed the White House, they held rallies. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton were, certainly instrumental in this. Some women ended up in prison, hunger strikes, anything to get their cause known to the wider public. And of course, not only with women getting the right to vote, women get increased educational opportunities. Women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. All right. So certainly Susan B. Anthony worked in the 1800s as a leader for the women's suffrage movement. She fought for women to have the right to vote. She was arrested, in fact, for trying to vote, and she largely knew that she was going to be arrested. It wasn't a surprise. Okay. But what it did do was give her a platform, a wider platform for her to speak her message, because in any court, certainly when women get arrested in those days, it was news, and the judge has to give the defendant time to speak. And when the judge asked her, "Do you have anything to say?" she most certainly did. Okay. One of the sad things, Susan B. Anthony worked her life to get women the right to vote, but she died before the 19th Amendment was passed, and she never lived long enough to see her life's work come to fruition. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, again, she worked with Susan B. Anthony. Stanton was much more of an organizer than a speaker. And so she helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in this country. She also wanted not just educational rights for women, voting rights for women. She also wanted property rights for women. In these days, if you were a woman and you were married, your property legally became the property of your husband. And employment rights, business rights. Women were not able to become largely a professional employer. They couldn't really sign contracts, that sort of thing. So it made life for them very, very difficult. So the four things that you need to know were voting rights, property rights, employment or business rights, and educational opportunity were really the four things that the suffrage movement wanted, not just the right to vote. And finally, there was the temperance movement. So, temperance means the limiting or banning of alcohol. And there were groups who were opposed to the making and consuming of alcohol. They were supported, and in fact, they won. They got alcohol banned in this country through the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. And this is Carrie Nation. She was a famous temperance movement leader, and she was known for walking into saloons and smashing them with hatchets. She would break up the place, break up the kegs of beer and whiskey. She would break up the bottles, and she called them a hatchetation. And so she was quite a force to be reckoned with. So here's a little bit on Carrie Nation. See if we can get this to go here.
When I went to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, there were 7 dives where drinks were sold. I began to ask, why should we have the saloon when Kansas was a prohibition state and our Constitution made it a crime to manufacture, barter, sell, or give away intoxicating drinks? These dive keepers really were not as much to blame as the city officials who were in league with this lawless element and could see the wicked walking on every side and the vilest men exalted. Carrie Nation.
Carrie Nation's life was filled with tragedy. Her mother died in an insane asylum, convinced she was Queen Victoria. Her first husband drank himself to death. A second unhappy marriage would end in divorce. She determined to give herself over to the struggle against what she called the place where the serpent drink crushed the hopes of my early years, the saloon. Kansas had already banned the sale of alcohol in every one of its 105 counties, but the state's dusty cow towns and large cities alike were filled with thirsty men, and no one paid much attention to the law. As president of the Barber County WCTU, Carrie Nation had led peaceful marches that had had little effect, wrote letters to legislators and lawmen that were never even answered, and eventually became convinced God wished her to do more.
On the 6th of June, 1900, before retiring, I threw myself downward at the foot of my bed and told the Lord to use me in any way to suppress the dreadful curse of liquor. I told him I wished I had 1,000 lives, that I would give him all of them. And I wanted him to make it known to me some way. The next morning, before I awoke, I heard these words very distinctly. Go to Kiowa, and I'll stand by you.
The next morning, with an armload of what she called smashers, rocks and bottles wrapped in paper to look like harmless packages, she strode into a saloon in Kiowa.
I told the owner, Mr. Dobson, get out of the way. I don't want to strike you, but I'm going to break up this den of vice. I began to throw at the mirror and the bottles below the mirror. Mr. Dobson and his companion jumped into a corner, seemed very much terrified. From that, I went to another saloon until I had destroyed 3. The other dive keepers closed up, stood in front of their places, and would not let me in. By this time, the streets were crowded with people. One boy, about 15 years old, seemed perfectly wild with joy. I have since thought of that being a significant sign, for to smash saloons will save the boy.
She dared the sheriff to arrest her. He did not. She moved on to Wichita, to attack the most opulent saloon in town, the bar in the Hotel Carey. When a policeman arrested her there for defacing property, she shouted at him, "I am defacing nothing. I am destroying." "You put me in here a cub," she said from behind bars, "but I will go out a roaring lion, and I will make all hell howl." Her exploits were front-page news. Hundreds of congratulatory telegrams arrived from all over the country. As soon as she got out, she attacked another saloon, this time with the weapon that would become her symbol, a hatchet. Jailed and released once more, she moved on to the town of Enterprise, did further damage there, and then appeared in Topeka, the state capital, and home to dozens of flourishing saloons, all of them illegal. The leaders of the Topeka WCTU declared themselves not in accord with her methods. "I tell you, ladies," she answered, "you don't know how much joy you will have until you begin to smash, smash, smash." The governor implored her not to do any more damage. She told him that if he didn't enforce the law, she had no choice. "You are a woman," he said, "and a woman must know a woman's place." She walked out of his office and called for a hatchetation. Many Kansans believed Nation was at least half mad, but hundreds of women and a smaller number of men rallied to her, bringing their own stones and bricks, sticks and hatchets, and calling themselves the Home Defenders Army. Proprietors of the local saloons tried and failed to stop them. She and her followers tore apart a joint favored by state legislators called the Senate, then went on to smash a second bar, a barn filled with saloon fixtures, and a warehouse stacked high with barrels of beer. That day, Carrie Nation was jailed and released 4 times. Within the month, her admirers would attack more than 100 saloons in at least 50 Kansas towns. Anxious state legislators rushed through a bill to strengthen enforcement of the law and pacify her and her Home Defenders Army. It was a remarkable victory. Carrie Nation hoped her movement would spread across the country and sweep away all of the nation's saloons. But once again, like the Woman's Crusade, it died almost as quickly as it had arisen. Carrie Nation never stopped crusading, in saloons and churches, lecture halls, even on the vaudeville stage. For many, she became a figure of fun, even ridicule. But so long as she lived, bartenders never stopped keeping a wary eye out for her and her dreaded hatchet.
Every movement needs some people call attention to itself by bold action. She knew that you had to draw attention and you needed the press following you. You had to make the right enemies. I don't think she's at all representative of the movement. She's simply the one who called attention to it. And then patient, hardworking people followed through.
There you go. Okay. So a little bit on Carrie Nation. And remember, it often comes up the question, well, why didn't she get arrested and be put in jail and kept in jail? Because remember that in Kansas at the time, alcohol was already illegal. Kansas was a dry state. And so when she's smashing these bars, it's hard to keep somebody in jail who broke up something that was illegal in the first place. And alcohol was illegal. It's just nobody had much of an interest in enforcing those laws. So they didn't until Carrie Nation came along. And so there we have it. There's kind of the end of it all. And we're going to leave off there for this week. And we'll pick up with a few more specific examples next week. So as you are doing this, I want you to fill in your notes that go along with this, and all this, of course, is in your Schoology page. And then there's a little reading on the progressive movement and some questions that go along with that. And that's your stuff for the week. All right, take care, and we'll see you next time.